They thought removing her from first class would be routine, but they had no idea they were about to ground their own careers before the plane even left the gate. The cabin lights glowed warm against polished leather seats as passengers settled in, the quiet hum of the aircraft wrapping the space in a soft, controlled calm that only money seemed to buy. Emily Carter stepped into first class without hesitation, her shoes making a faint, measured sound against the aisle as if she had walked this path 100 times before, though nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged there. She wore a simple cream cardigan over a plain blouse, her hair tied back neatly, no designer logos, no flashing jewelry, nothing that signaled status in a room where status was everything. A few heads turned, subtle at first, then more deliberate, eyes scanning her from head to toe, trying to place her, trying to understand how someone like her had ended up here. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with quiet judgment, the kind that never needed words to be heard. Emily placed her small carry-on into the overhead bin with practiced ease and took her seat by the window, her movements calm, unhurried, as though the space belonged to her just as much as anyone else. She buckled her seatbelt and looked out toward the runway, her expression steady, almost detached, as if she were somewhere else entirely. A man across the aisle adjusted his tailored jacket, glancing at her again, his brows tightening slightly. Two women seated a few rows ahead leaned toward each other, whispering just loud enough for the tone to carry, if not the words. It didn't take long. It never did. The cabin curtain shifted slightly as Laura Bennett, the lead flight attendant, stepped forward with a polished smile that had been perfected over years of dealing with high-paying passengers and even higher expectations. Her posture was flawless, her uniform crisp, every detail communicating authority wrapped in courtesy. She paused when her eyes landed on Emily, and for a brief moment, something flickered beneath her smile, a calculation, a quiet decision already forming. Laura approached with measured steps, her heels barely making a sound against the carpeted aisle. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said, her voice smooth, professional, but carrying an edge that only revealed itself if you were listening closely. Emily turned her head slightly, offering a polite nod. "Good afternoon." Laura's gaze lingered, scanning Emily's outfit, her bag, her seat, as though something about the equation didn't add up. "May I see your boarding pass?" she asked, still smiling. Emily reached into her bag without hesitation and handed it over. Laura glanced down, her expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. Around them, the quiet hum of the cabin seemed to sharpen, attention subtly shifting in their direction. Laura looked back up, her smile now thinner, more controlled. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her tone still polite but firmer now. "There seems to be a mistake." The words hung in the air, light but heavy enough to be felt by everyone within earshot. Emily's eyes remained steady, unbothered. "What kind of mistake?" she asked softly. Laura tilted her head slightly, as if offering patience she didn't truly feel. "This seat is reserved for first-class passengers." A pause followed, brief but charged, as if the entire cabin collectively leaned in without moving. Emily didn't react immediately. She simply looked at Laura, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, as though the situation unfolding around her was something she had seen before, something predictable. And in that moment, before a single voice was raised, before a single decision was finalized, something invisible shifted in the room, a tension that hadn't been there before, quiet but undeniable, like the calm just before something changes everything. Emily lifted her small carry-on from the overhead compartment with the same unhurried precision she had shown when she first entered the cabin, her movements controlled, almost deliberate, as if time itself moved differently around her. The zipper made a soft, clean sound as she adjusted the handle, and for a brief second, no one spoke, no one shifted, no one even pretended not to watch anymore. Laura stepped slightly to the side, giving her space, but also creating a subtle path forward, a silent expectation that Emily would comply quickly and quietly. Just another passenger redirected, just another minor inconvenience resolved. But there was something about the pace of the moment that refused to move forward as expected. Emily did not rush. She did not apologize. She did not look embarrassed. Instead, she turned once more toward her seat, smoothing the edge of the blanket that had been folded neatly beside it, a small, almost insignificant gesture that somehow carried weight, as if she were leaving a place she respected, not being removed from it. The man across the aisle lowered his phone slightly, no longer pretending to scroll, his attention fixed entirely on her now. A younger flight attendant near the galley glanced at Laura, her expression uncertain, as though she sensed something was off, but could not yet name it. "We really do need to proceed, ma'am," Laura said, her tone tightening just a fraction, the polished calm beginning to strain under the quiet resistance she could not quite control. Emily nodded gently. "Of course," she replied, her voice soft, steady, almost kind, as if she were the one easing Laura's tension rather than the other way around. And then she stepped into the aisle fully, standing beside her seat for just a moment longer than expected, her gaze drifting across the cabin, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in quiet observation, as though she were taking in every detail, every face, every assumption that had already been made about her. It was not a long look, but it was enough. Enough for the room to feel seen. Enough for the silence to deepen. From the front of the aircraft, another announcement came through, this time more specific, the captain's voice calm but edged with a note of coordination. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently awaiting final clearance for departure, as well as one remaining passenger. We appreciate your patience." The words settled over the cabin like a thin layer of tension, barely noticeable at first, but present. A few passengers shifted in their seats again, some glancing toward the entrance of the aircraft, others back at Emily, as if trying to connect two things that did not yet seem related. Laura exhaled quietly, her focus returning to the task in front of her. "Right this way," she said, gesturing toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. Emily adjusted her grip on her bag and took a step forward, but then paused again, just briefly, her eyes flicking once more toward the front of the cabin, where the entrance door remained open, where the jet bridge connected the aircraft to the terminal, where movement had not yet fully stopped. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but it stretched just long enough to be felt. Laura noticed it. The younger attendant noticed it. Even the man across the aisle noticed it. And in that pause, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the quiet before a realization that had not yet arrived. Emily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not directed at anyone in particular, not meant to be seen, but it was there, calm and knowing, as if she understood something no one else in that cabin did yet. Then, without another word, she began to move forward, following Laura toward the curtain, her steps measured, her posture relaxed, her presence steady in a way that did not match the situation unfolding around her. Behind them, the cabin remained unusually quiet, the kind of silence that was no longer comfortable, no longer casual, but waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for someone. And just beyond the open aircraft door, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, carrying a weight that had not yet entered the room, but was already changing it. The footsteps grew clearer, measured and unhurried, echoing softly from the jet bridge into the open doorway of the aircraft. And something about the rhythm of them made the cabin feel smaller, tighter, as if the air itself was shifting to make room for what was about to enter. Laura paused instinctively, her hand still lightly extended toward the curtain, her professional composure holding in place, but no longer as effortless as before. Emily stopped as well, not because she was told to, but because she chose to, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, as though she had been expecting this moment all along. The younger flight attendant near the galley straightened subtly, her eyes flicking toward the entrance, sensing a change she could not yet explain. One by one, passengers turned their attention toward the front of the plane, conversations fading completely now, replaced by a silence that was no longer passive but alert. A man appeared in the doorway, tall, composed, his presence quiet but unmistakably commanding. He stepped into the cabin with the kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself, dressed in a tailored dark suit that fit him with effortless precision, his posture straight, his gaze focused. Daniel Carter did not look around immediately. He did not scan the room or acknowledge the watching eyes. Instead, his attention moved with purpose, as though he already knew exactly where he needed to look. A ground staff member behind him spoke briefly, but Daniel only gave a slight nod before continuing forward, his pace steady, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. Laura's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, recognition flickering across her face before she could fully contain it. It was not dramatic, not exaggerated, but it was there, a subtle tightening around her eyes, a recalculation happening in real time. The younger attendant noticed it immediately, her own posture adjusting in response, her uncertainty now sharpening into awareness. Emily remained where she was, her bag resting lightly in her hand, her gaze meeting Daniel's as he approached, and in that single exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something quiet but absolute. Daniel slowed as he reached the first row of seats, his eyes briefly taking in the scene, the open overhead compartment, the passengers turned toward the aisle, the tension that lingered like a held breath. Then his gaze settled on Emily, and for a fraction of a second, the controlled neutrality in his expression softened, just enough to reveal recognition, just enough to confirm what the room did not yet understand. Laura stepped forward quickly, her smile returning, but now it carried a different energy, sharper, more urgent. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her tone respectful, polished, but no longer casual. "Welcome aboard. We were just assisting a passenger with a seating adjustment." The words came out smoothly, but they landed differently now, their meaning shifting under the weight of who had just arrived. Daniel's eyes moved from Emily to Laura, calm, steady, unreadable. He did not respond immediately. He did not acknowledge the explanation. Instead, he looked at Emily again, taking in her stance, her bag, the space she had been asked to leave, and then back to Laura. "A seating adjustment," he repeated, his voice low, even, but carrying a clarity that cut through the quiet cabin. It was not a question. It was not quite a statement either. It was something in between, something that demanded precision without raising volume. Laura felt it instantly. The balance had shifted. "Yes, sir," she replied, her composure tightening as she tried to maintain control. "There appeared to be a discrepancy, and we are ensuring all protocols are followed." Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, the silence stretching just enough to make the entire cabin feel it. Every passenger now fully aware that they were witnessing something they had not anticipated. Behind him, the open aircraft door remained still, the outside world momentarily paused, as if even departure itself was waiting for this moment to resolve. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his posture, Daniel spoke again, his tone calm, precise, and impossible to ignore. "She is not moving." The words were simple, almost quiet, but they landed with a weight that silenced whatever remained of the room's uncertainty, leaving nothing behind but a single, undeniable realization beginning to unfold. The words did not echo, they did not need to, because the weight behind them carried farther than volume ever could, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe as the meaning settled into the room. Laura felt it first, not as sound, but as pressure, the sudden realization that whatever authority she thought she held had just been quietly, effortlessly overridden. Her smile faltered, just slightly, the edges no longer holding their shape as her mind raced to recover control of a situation that was slipping beyond her reach. "Sir, I understand your concern," she began, her voice still polished but now threaded with urgency. "However, we must ensure that all passengers are properly seated according to—" Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply looked at her, and that was enough to stop the sentence before it could finish. The silence that followed was not empty, it was decisive. Emily remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as though nothing unexpected had occurred, as though this moment was unfolding exactly as it should. The younger attendant near the galley shifted her weight, her eyes moving quickly between Laura and Daniel, the realization spreading across her face faster now, sharper, undeniable. Passengers who had once watched with quiet curiosity now sat completely still, their earlier assumptions dissolving into something else entirely, something closer to understanding, though not yet complete. Laura tried again, adjusting her stance, her tone tightening in an attempt to reclaim structure. "We are simply following airline policy," she said, choosing each word carefully, and ensuring the integrity of the first-class experience for all guests. Daniel's gaze did not waver. "And you believe she does not belong here," he said, his voice even, not accusing, not emotional, but precise enough to strip the statement down to its truth. Laura hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. It was small, barely visible, but it broke the rhythm of her authority completely. "That is not what I said," she replied quickly, though the confidence in her tone no longer matched the certainty she had shown before. Daniel let the silence stretch again, just long enough for everyone in the cabin to feel it, to sit in it, to recognize what had just been revealed without it needing to be spoken outright. Then, calmly, without any change in posture, he spoke again. "Then let me make this simple," he said. "She stays exactly where she is." There was no emphasis, no raised tone, no dramatic pause, and yet the finality of it settled into the room like a locked door. Laura opened her mouth slightly, as if to respond, but no words came out immediately. Behind her, the younger attendant lowered her gaze, her posture shifting subtly as though aligning herself with a new understanding of the situation. A faint murmur moved through the cabin, not loud, not disruptive, but enough to signal that everyone now recognized the shift that had taken place. Emily finally moved, but not away, not toward the curtain. Instead, she turned slightly, her hand resting lightly on the top of her seat, reclaiming the space without a single confrontational gesture. She did not look at the other passengers. She did not seek validation. She simply existed in that moment with quiet certainty, and somehow, that made the moment even heavier. Laura inhaled slowly, her composure now visibly strained, the polished confidence replaced by careful calculation. "May I ask," she said, her voice softer now, more cautious, "your relationship to the passenger?" It was a question she should have asked earlier, a question that now carried more weight than she intended. Daniel's expression did not change. "You already addressed her," he replied calmly. "Now I am addressing you." The words were not harsh, but they landed with unmistakable clarity, drawing a line that could not be easily crossed back. The cabin fell completely silent again, deeper than before, as the final piece of understanding settled into place. And in that silence, Laura Bennett, who had been so certain only moments ago, found herself standing in a position she had not anticipated, facing a reality she could no longer control, as the consequences of a single assumption unfolded in front of everyone, without a single raised voice, without a single dramatic gesture, just quiet, undeniable truth. The silence did not break, it settled, deeper and heavier than before, as if the entire cabin had collectively realized that something irreversible had just happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Laura stood still for a fraction longer than she intended, her mind moving quickly, recalibrating, searching for a way to regain control without escalating further, but every option seemed to dissolve the moment she considered it. The structure she had relied on, the authority she had leaned into, no longer held the same weight, and she could feel it slipping, not just in front of Daniel, but in front of every passenger watching. "Sir," she said carefully, her tone softer now, measured, "if there has been a misunderstanding, we can certainly review the situation and ensure that." Daniel did not interrupt, but his stillness alone made the sentence feel unnecessary before it was even completed. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge Emily beside him, his presence shifting subtly from confrontation to clarity, as though the situation no longer required force, only truth. "There is no misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm, steady, and unmistakably final. Laura felt the words land before she could respond, and for the first time since the exchange began, she hesitated openly. Behind her, the younger attendant lowered her gaze further, her posture now aligned with a reality she could no longer ignore. A passenger in the second row slowly set down his glass of water, the soft clink barely audible, but somehow marking the moment more clearly than any announcement could have. The cabin had gone completely still. Daniel reached into the inner pocket of his jacket with an unhurried motion, his movements controlled, deliberate, not rushed, not performative, simply precise. He removed a slim, dark card holder and opened it, the action simple, almost routine, yet it carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere instantly. Laura's eyes followed the motion, her expression tightening as she saw what he held, recognition arriving fully now, no longer a flicker, no longer uncertain. He did not extend the card immediately. Instead, he looked at her, giving her a moment, just enough time to understand before he confirmed it. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said quietly. The name did not need explanation. It moved through the room faster than any introduction could have, connecting with recognition in the faces of those who knew, and curiosity in those who did not. But either way, the impact was immediate. Laura's posture straightened instinctively, her composure snapping into a different form, one shaped not by authority, but by awareness. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice now carrying a level of respect that had not been present before, though it arrived too late to change what had already happened. Daniel finally extended the card, not as a gesture of power, but as confirmation, a simple alignment of identity with reality. Laura accepted it carefully, her fingers steady but her expression no longer fully controlled as her eyes moved across the details she already understood. The younger attendant glanced at the card as well, her breath catching slightly as the final piece fell into place. Emily remained beside him, unchanged, her presence still quiet, still grounded, as if none of this altered who she was, only how others were now forced to see her. Daniel closed the distance just slightly, not invading, not imposing, but making his position unmistakably clear. "And she is my wife," he added, his tone even, not louder, not sharper, just complete. The words settled into the cabin with a finality that left no space for reinterpretation. A ripple moved through the passengers, subtle but undeniable, the shift from assumption to realization passing from one row to the next without a single word being spoken. Laura lowered the card slightly, her gaze lifting back to Emily, and in that moment, the contrast between what she had assumed and what stood in front of her became impossible to ignore. The authority she had exercised minutes earlier now felt misplaced, exposed, fragile in a way she could not undo. The aircraft remained still, the door still open, departure still waiting, as if even the journey itself had paused to witness the quiet unraveling of a moment built entirely on perception. And in that stillness, nothing needed to be said again, because everything that mattered had already been revealed. Laura's fingers tightened slightly around the card, not enough to draw attention, but enough to betray the shift happening beneath her carefully maintained composure. The realization settling in fully now, no longer something she could soften or reinterpret, but something she had to face directly. The polished confidence she had carried just minutes ago had transformed into something more restrained, more cautious, as if every word she considered now had to pass through a new understanding of consequence. She handed the card back with both hands, a gesture more formal than necessary, but one that reflected the change in balance that everyone in the cabin could feel. "Mr. Carter," she said again, her voice quieter, steadier, but now carrying a weight of acknowledgement that had not been there before. Daniel accepted the card without looking at it, sliding it back into his jacket with the same controlled ease, his attention never fully leaving the moment in front of him. Emily shifted slightly, her hand resting once more on the armrest of her seat, reclaiming it without ceremony, without emphasis, as though it had always been hers, as though nothing had truly changed except the way others were now forced to see it. The younger attendant took a small step back, instinctively creating space, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a clear understanding that the situation had moved beyond her role, beyond anything she could influence. Passengers who had once watched with quiet curiosity now sat completely still, their expressions altered, some looking down, others staring ahead, as if suddenly aware of their own participation in a moment they had not questioned soon enough. Laura drew in a slow breath, her shoulders settling into a posture that no longer projected authority but restraint, and when she spoke again, her words were chosen with care. "Mrs. Carter," she said, turning toward Emily, her tone respectful, deliberate. "You are of course welcome to remain in your seat." There was no intention to cause discomfort. The sentence was smooth, professionally constructed, but it carried an undercurrent that could not fully erase what had already taken place. Emily met her gaze calmly, her expression unchanged, her voice soft but clear. "I understand," she replied, and in those 2 words there was no accusation, no resentment, only a quiet acknowledgement that seemed to settle more heavily than any confrontation could have. Laura nodded once, a small, controlled motion, before stepping back, her presence withdrawing from the center of the moment she had created. The shift was immediate. The space that had felt tense and uncertain moments ago now held a different kind of silence, one that did not press but lingered, reflective, aware. Daniel turned slightly toward Emily, his posture easing just enough to reveal a different side of his presence, one that belonged not to authority, but to familiarity. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice lowering in a way that softened the edges of the moment without diminishing its significance. Emily gave a small nod, the faintest hint of a smile returning to her lips, steady and composed. "I am," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no lingering doubt, only calm assurance. Daniel studied her for a brief second longer, as if confirming something unspoken, then gave a slight nod of his own before stepping back just enough to allow the cabin to reset around them. The captain's voice came through once more, this time with a tone of readiness, announcing final boarding completion and imminent departure. The aircraft door began to close slowly, the outside world slipping away as the cabin prepared to move forward, but the atmosphere inside had already changed in a way that would not be undone by altitude or distance. Laura moved toward the galley, her steps measured, her posture composed once more, but no longer untouched. The younger attendant followed quietly, her movements more careful now, her awareness sharpened by what she had just witnessed. Emily settled back into her seat, fastening her seatbelt once again, her gaze returning to the window, the runway stretching out ahead, calm and steady. Daniel took the seat beside her, not as a display, not as a statement, but simply because that was where he belonged. And as the engines began to build, a low, powerful hum rising beneath the surface of the cabin, the silence that remained was no longer about tension or judgment, but about something quieter, something clearer, the kind of understanding that does not need to be spoken to be remembered. The aircraft began to move. Slowly at first, a gentle pushback from the gate that carried the entire cabin into motion, but inside, something far more lasting had already shifted, something that no announcement or routine could reset. The low hum of the engines grew deeper, more powerful, filling the space with a steady vibration that seemed to underline the silence rather than replace it. Emily sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the tarmac as it slid past in slow, measured lines, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the events of the last few minutes had simply passed through her without leaving any trace of urgency or discomfort. Beside her, Daniel rested back into his seat, his posture relaxed but attentive, his presence no longer commanding the room, yet still shaping it in ways that could not be ignored. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit adjusted his tie again, but this time his movements were slower, more deliberate, as though he were reconsidering something he had not questioned before. A few rows ahead, one of the women who had whispered earlier now stared quietly at her hands, her earlier confidence replaced by a reflective stillness. No one spoke about what had happened, but it lingered, present in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way they shifted slightly in their seats, in the quiet awareness that something important had been revealed without ever needing to be announced. From the galley, Laura Bennett stood just out of sight of most passengers, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her stillness now carried a different weight. She watched the cabin through the narrow opening, her gaze briefly settling on Emily, then moving away, not out of dismissal, but out of recognition, a quiet understanding that the moment she had tried to control had instead exposed something she could not undo. The younger attendant stood beside her, silent, attentive, absorbing everything without speaking, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a careful awareness that would not easily fade. "We will begin our service shortly," Laura said finally, her voice steady, professional, but softer than before, as if shaped by what she had just experienced rather than by routine. She stepped back into the aisle, her movements precise, controlled, but no longer carrying the same effortless authority. As she approached Emily's row again, she paused briefly, not out of obligation, but intention, and inclined her head slightly, a gesture small enough to go unnoticed by most, but clear enough for those who understood. "Mrs. Carter," she said quietly, "if there is anything you need during the flight, please let us know." Emily turned her head slightly, meeting her gaze with the same calm presence she had held from the beginning. "Thank you," she replied simply, and there was no edge in her voice, no trace of resentment, only a quiet acceptance that seemed to close the moment more completely than any apology could have. Laura nodded once, then continued down the aisle, her steps measured, her composure restored, but transformed. The plane picked up speed, the runway stretching ahead in long, converging lines as the engines surged, lifting the aircraft into the air with a smooth, powerful motion. As the ground fell away beneath them, the cabin settled into a new kind of stillness, not the tension from before, but something quieter, more reflective, the kind of silence that follows understanding. Emily rested her hand lightly on the armrest, her eyes following the horizon as the sky opened wide beyond the window, endless and calm. Daniel glanced at her briefly, then forward again, his expression steady, as if nothing more needed to be said. And in that quiet assent, above the noise, above the assumptions left behind on the ground, the lesson of the moment remained, not spoken, not enforced, but present in every glance that was now more careful, every silence that now carried meaning, a reminder that what people choose to see is not always what is true, and that sometimes the smallest judgment can reveal the largest mistake. At 35,000 feet, the world below became small, distant, reduced to patterns of light and shadow that no longer carried the weight of assumptions or quick judgments, and inside the cabin, the quiet that remained had settled into something deeper than silence, something closer to reflection. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed gently through the space, followed by the subtle movements of passengers adjusting, reaching for drinks, returning to conversations that now felt slightly more measured than before. Emily remained by the window, her gaze drifting across the endless stretch of sky, calm and unhurried, as if the moment that had unfolded on the ground had already found its place within her, processed and released without resistance. Daniel sat beside her, reviewing a document on his tablet, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer commanding attention, yet still quietly anchoring the space around him. A flight attendant passed through the aisle, her steps careful, her tone softer with each interaction, as though the atmosphere itself had instructed her to move differently. When she reached Emily's row, she paused briefly, offering a warm, respectful smile that held no trace of assumption, only awareness. Emily returned the gesture with a small nod. Nothing more, nothing needed. A few rows ahead, the man in the navy suit finally leaned back, exhaling slowly, his earlier tension replaced by something quieter, perhaps reconsideration, perhaps understanding. The two women who had whispered before now spoke in low voices, their words indistinct, but their tone noticeably changed, stripped of the casual certainty they had carried earlier. No one referenced what had happened, but it lived in the space between them, shaping the way they looked at one another, the way they chose their words, the way they held their silence. From the galley, Laura Bennett stood for a moment longer than necessary before stepping back into the aisle, her movements composed, but no longer automatic. She approached Emily's seat once more, this time without urgency, without authority, only intention. "Mrs. Carter," she said quietly, her voice steady, respectful, "we appreciate your patience earlier." The words were simple, carefully chosen, not an apology in form, but one in meaning, delivered in a way that preserved dignity without denying truth. Emily turned slightly, meeting her gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning. "Thank you," she replied. And in that moment, the exchange was complete, not because everything had been undone, but because it had been understood. Laura inclined her head gently, then moved on, her posture aligned now with a different kind of awareness, one that would not easily fade once the flight ended. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft continued its steady path forward, the outside sky shifting into deeper shades of blue, the horizon stretching endlessly beyond sight. Emily rested her head lightly against the seat, her eyes closing for a brief moment, not in escape, but in quiet rest, as though she carried nothing from before that needed to be held any longer. Daniel glanced at her once, then back at the window, his expression thoughtful, composed, as if he too understood that the moment had already done what it needed to do. And as the plane moved forward through the open sky, far above the ground where assumptions had once defined the room, what remained was not the memory of who was right or wrong, but something quieter, something more lasting, a recognition that dignity does not announce itself. It reveals itself, often in the moments when it is most overlooked, and that day, without a single raised voice, without a single act of force, an entire cabin had been reminded of what it truly looks like. In this powerful collection of touching stories, a simple woman is quietly removed from first class by airline staff who believe she does not belong. But everything changes when her husband, a man of quiet authority, steps in and reveals a truth no one expected. These touching stories explore dignity, perception, and the consequences of judging others too quickly. As tension builds inside a luxury cabin, passengers witness how a calm and composed woman transforms an entire room without raising her voice, making these touching stories deeply emotional and thought-provoking. Through subtle reactions and silent moments, the narrative captures how assumptions collapse when reality is revealed, reinforcing why touching stories like this resonate so strongly with audiences. The contrast between appearance and truth unfolds naturally, showing how respect should never be based on status alone, a message at the heart of many touching stories. By the end, what remains is not conflict but reflection, reminding viewers that the true measure of a person is revealed in moments of pressure, making this one of the most memorable touching stories about dignity, humility, and quiet strength.